everyone! My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today we are going to be looking into an answer to a question that has been on my mind a lot lately, which is how many people are actually into BDSM? How many of us are actually kinky? And when you start to dive into this, you quickly run into some issues because places like Psychology Today or Cosmopolitan or the Daily Mail love having salacious headlines about how kinky people are, like 50 Shades of Grey leads to a 15% increase in adults trying BDSM, or America, kinkiest nation on earth, and that can make it sort of confusing to tell how true any of those statements are. But serendipitously, as I was starting to explore the research, I ran into an article by none other than Race Bannon, whose name might be familiar to you if you have seen some of my other more recent videos. He is a longtime educator and advocate who is most well known in the BDSM world for being the person who spearheaded the campaign to get the DSM to separate between healthy, consensual BDSM activities and non-consensual clinical sadomasochism. And he had an article on his blog that was called "Everyone is a Little Bit Kinky." Obviously a very provocative headline, something that brings to mind comedy routines of the 2000s proclaiming everyone is a little bit gay. But maybe there might be something to this, because in his writing he largely looks at the work of Justin Lehmiller, a social psychologist who in 2018 published a book called Tell Me What You Want, which was a scientific exploration of people's desire and fantasy lives. Lehmiller surveyed 4,175 adults in the United States across the entire range of genders, ages, sexual orientations, races, and relationship styles. Participants completed a 369-question survey inquiring about their fantasies, personalities, sexual histories, and demographics. Lehmiller found that he could categorize these fantasies into 7 main themes, as Bannon summarizes. 1. Multi-partner sex, threesomes, orgies, or gangbangs. 2. Power, control, bondage, discipline, dominance, submission, and sadomasochism, or BDSM for short. 3. Novelty, adventure, and variety. 4. Taboo or forbidden sex, including voyeurism, exhibitionism, and fetishes. 5. Passion, romance, and intimacy. 6. Non-monogamy and partner sharing, and 7. Erotic flexibility and gender bending. These 7 high-level fantasy categories accounted for nearly 96% of all of participants' favorite fantasies, indicating these are largely building blocks for all fantasy content. Now, all of these categories are not exclusive from each other. You had the option, and people did choose multiple different categories for their preferred fantasies. So, for example, 47% selected multiple partners, 46% selected BDSM, and 30% selected being in a non-monogamous relationship. And what I found most shocking is that this research indicated that over 93% of men and 96% of women had ever had any fantasies involving BDSM. If that is true, that is huge news. But of course, I couldn't just leave it at one book, one data set, and say, great, that's everything I needed to know. Case closed, right? No, absolutely not. I had to deep dive into the research and see if we had anything else that was available that either looked at a similar question or maybe also examined not just people's fantasies, but how those fantasies translate into actually doing BDSM. And surprisingly, there are a number of studies on this, and the picture they show together is relatively clear. So one of the first pieces I looked at was a study from 2015 called "What Exactly is an Unusual Sexual Fantasy?" That only came out 3 years prior to Tell Me What You Want being released, and they also wanted to look at exactly how common different types of fantasies were. In order to do that, they surveyed a group of people and had them rank various fantasies on a scale from 0 to 7, with 0 indicating no interest at all and 7 indicating a very strong interest. In the initial ranking portion of the survey, 64% of women and 53% of men had a fantasy interest in being dominated. 52% of women and 46% of men had a fantasy interest in being tied up. 43% of men had a fantasy interest in spanking or whipping someone for pleasure. And finally, 46% of women and 59% of men had a fantasy interest in dominating someone else. These percentages came from participants ranking the fantasies at least a 3 or higher, which indicated at minimum a mild interest. And this does seem to line up with Leigh-Miller's findings of people selecting BDSM as a fantasy interest about 46% of the time. They then also gave their participants an open-ended opportunity to write out their favorite fantasy, which was later analyzed by the researchers. And the results here were really interesting. So for example, for women, the third most common fantasy theme was focusing on their own submission at nearly 19%. This was only behind 2 other things. One, the fact the location of the fantasy was usually specified, such as being at a hotel or at a beach. And then second, the fact that the fantasies often had the presence of a current partner. Then for men, their second most common fantasy theme was the presence of fetishism. Number 1 was the presence of voyeurism, which together made up 29% of all common fantasy themes. Now, I do find this very interesting. However, just because you have a fantasy doesn't mean you want to make that a reality. Some people like to just keep things in their heads. Sometimes you have fantasies that you couldn't do in real life, and just because you have had a fantasy about doing something once doesn't mean that you were actually a member of the BDSM community. So of course, I wanted to look at next, how does having these fantasies translate into people actually doing BDSM? What proportion of people actually then go on to act out these things in real life? And that starts to paint a pretty telling picture. Another 2015 study of 2,000 adults, published by Plus One, explored Americans' interest in and experiences with various BDSM acts. In summary, 21% of women and 22% of men said they have tied up a partner or been tied up during sex before. 14% of women and 16% of men said they have playfully whipped a partner or been playfully whipped as a part of sex play. 34% of women and 30% of men said they have spanked a partner or been spanked during sex before. And finally, 2.6% of women and 4.3% of men said they have been to a BDSM party or dungeon before. The study also found that even more Americans expressed interest in trying things like bondage, whipping, or going to a BDSM party compared to those that had actually engaged with it. So, in other words, BDSM interest appears to be more common than actual BDSM behavior. For example, they found that about 30% of both men and women had expressed an interest in either wanting to tie someone up or be tied up themselves. And about 8% of men and 6% of women wanted to try going to a BDSM party. And this seems to parallel other studies that came out earlier. A 2005 survey by Durex found that an average of 20% of sexually active adults around the globe have tried sex using blindfolds, masks, and other forms of bondage. The same study showed that 36% of Americans in particular had tried such acts. Adam and Eve also did their own survey of Americans, which found again that 27% had ever engaged in some form of bondage or impact play. But not every study lines up with this 20 to 30% range. For example, a 2001 to 2002 Australian study of more than 20,000 people between the ages of 16 and 59 found that only 1.8% of sexually active adults consider themselves to be involved in BDSM in the past year. And I could speculate all day about why that is, right? So for example, it could be because they used the term involved, which might indicate a more serious interest or regular occurrence compared to just casually maybe trying something once or twice. Maybe it could be because people didn't really know what BDSM was at the time. Maybe it could be because this was a phone survey instead of over the internet like almost everything else, in which case it would possibly be less self-selecting. Or it could be because of people's personal biases about what they consider BDSM to be and what that involves. BDSM to a lot of people is this kind of like foreign, weird, extreme, over here thing where a latex-clad dominatrix is beating a man in a gimp suit on the floor, senseless, and then stomping on him with like big boots. And when you look at that compared to maybe a little casual hair pulling, ice cubes, spanking, they seem like two totally different things, right? And so if you're thinking, well, this is what BDSM has to be, what I'm doing is definitely not that. And I don't think this was just merely confusion about the acronym BDSM, because they did take time during the study process to actually tell people this is what SM or BDSM is, this is the full acronym, so people could understand what those words actually meant. But going back to the 2015 study I mentioned, the numbers from this Australian study might not actually be too off base. For example, when you look at this on the scale of participation in the last year versus ever at all, you have about 1% of people having been to a dungeon in the past year. You have about 4.5% having tried bondage, 6% having tried whipping or impact play, and 14% of men and 20% of women trying spanking. Spanking apparently is enduringly popular, which I find interesting all on its own. Now, could it be that maybe Americans are just way more kinky than Australians, and so when you poll only Americans, you're going to get way higher numbers, right? But going back to the worldwide Durex study from 2005, only a couple years after that original Australian study, you have about 32% of Aussies that have said they have tried some kind of bondage during sex, compared to 36% of Americans. So actually the percentages, at least according to that, if we're going to calibrate from there, aren't actually really all that far off. I think what this points to instead is the importance of how you ask a question and how you phrase it, and how you set up something in a study taker's mind is really going to affect how they then proceed to answer. Asking someone, have you ever tried BDSM? They might picture that latex-clad dominatrix, compared to more specifically asking, have you done this particular activity? Because the first version of the question is really putting an idea of what that has to look like into people's brains, versus it can look like however you want it to look like. It just has to be this kind of activity, using ice cubes, using a blindfold, trying spanking, for example. And I think this is something that survey makers are going to have to consider in their future designs, because obviously you want to make sure that you are actually answering the question you want to have answered. And when you are contending with people's biases and assumptions, it's really important that you are being as accurate as possible and accounting for those potential biases when you are designing questions. Now that we have looked at so many different studies that are really focusing on fantasies and ever in a whole lifetime ever having tried BDSM, what I really want to know about are how many people make BDSM a regular part of their life. How many people do it on a recurring basis, as opposed to doing pegging once a year on a birthday, or trying spanking once and never again. And along the lines of actually figuring out how often people do something and how they self-identify with BDSM, I was only able to find one study, this time out of Belgium. According to the authors, quote, many people are at least fascinated by BDSM. suggesting that many, if not most, have sexual fantasies about it, and may even have experimented with it or even implement it on a regular basis in their sex life. And as no other published study looked into degrees of intensity of these practices, we decided to do it ourselves. But what exactly did they find? The survey of just over 1,000 Belgians, published in 2007, found that 7.6% of participants identified themselves as regular BDSM practitioners, with over 85% reporting that they only did so at home in private, with the remaining 15% participating outside of their homes, such as at hotels, dungeons, and parties. Which, when you do the math, shakes out to about 1.1% of people participating in BDSM publicly. And that lines up very nicely with both the Australian study at 1.8% and the 2015 study that about 1% of people have gone to a BDSM party or dungeon in the past year. More generally, about 12.5% of the population said they did at least one BDSM associated activity on a regular basis, with things like the use of ice cubes, blindfolds, or bondage being tried by about 20 to 24% of people at all. Curiously, going back to the 2005 Durex study, they had also found that about 24% of Belgians had tried bondage during sex, with 26% expressing interest in trying some kind of BDSM activity, comparable again to the 20 to 30% range we have seen in numerous other studies. Now, I have been rambling for almost an hour, my time, about all of these different studies, comparing fantasy and reality and practice and self-identification. What exactly does all of this mean? What I'm really getting in my head is this picture of an iceberg of BDSM involvement. And at the very top, on the widest part, you have the 96% of people that at some point ever have a fantasy about BDSM. Then under that, you have the 40 to 50% of people that have a BDSM associated fantasy as one of their favorite fantasies. Then you have the 20 to 30% that at least try some form of BDSM. Then you have the 12.5% that actually do a BDSM activity on a regular basis. Then you have 7% of people that self-identify as BDSM practitioners. And finally, right there at the very bottom, where I'm at, the 1% of people that self-identify as BDSM practitioners that also participate in the public scene. This, for me, really reestablishes what I talk about so much, especially during live streams when people ask about this, that what I do, what I talk about, is really the literal tip of an iceberg. It is such a small percentage of a percentage of a percentage of anyone that ever tries BDSM. And it really does seem that the most common way of engaging in BDSM is either just only through fantasy or through very occasional participation strictly in the bedroom and not taking it outside of that. And I think that is totally normal and okay. Now, I know, just to point this out, that I realize I am taking a bunch of different studies of different populations and combining them all together to try and create some kind of cohesive narrative. That's not really great science, but I'm not doing some kind of former research review. I'm not submitting this for anyone else to academically analyze. I'm just kind of throwing my thoughts and observations out there based on the limited research we do have. And of course, I do have my own critiques and questions. I would like to know more about the reputation of the journals, which had these studies published in them when they were published in an actual academic journal. I would want to know more about the actual survey questions and the surveys themselves, because none of these studies seem to actually provide a copy of their actual survey in their documentation. And I would just want to know in general their methodology, see if there was any kind of like number fudging, p-hacking going on, but all of that academic mumbo jumbo out of the way and kind of just setting that to the side for now. I do think it is interesting how you have these studies from decades apart in time, from totally different population groups that are seemingly having a little bit of a correlation maybe. And that is what I got out of this experiment and looking at all of these different documents, at least for myself. Now, at the end of the day here, what we want to be able to answer is everyone actually kinky? And looking at everything, I think what I can say is maybe. But it depends on how you look at it, really. And even if it's not the case that literally everyone is kinky, I still think it is high time we worked to dismantle the stigma and shame around having BDSM fantasies. Because I know so many people that feel awful about themselves, that feel so alone because they want to be a sadist, or they have fantasies about wearing a diaper, or being tied up, or tying someone else up. And they just have this level of inner guilt and self-hatred almost just because of those things they fantasize about. When in reality, when you look at the numbers of it, those fantasies are normal. They are common. And it's also dangerous when you have a really high percentage of the population that fantasizes about something, that wants to do it, but then also can't talk about it because it is a social taboo to do so. Because it being a social taboo doesn't mean people don't try it. It means they try it without asking for help, without looking for resources, without educating themselves. And so many people end up doing things that they don't know are dangerous, or they don't use safe words because they don't have any education or any help to understand this thing that they want to experiment with. And I think we all deserve, regardless of our participation level, be it just in the bedroom once a year or every day of the week, we all deserve to have safer, happier, more accepting, intimate lives, no matter what shape that happens to take. And I would love to know what you all have to think about this down in the comment section below. This was a doozy of a video to make, so I really hoped that you all enjoyed it. Any other thoughts, anything else, you can put in a comment down below. I would really appreciate it. If you want to make sure to catch up on all of my videos and not miss out on anything else, you can go ahead and subscribe, because I make videos twice a week about all sorts of kink and BDSM related topics. And finally, if you want to support what I do, the best way you can do that is with Patreon. A link to that will be down below. That is literally what makes all of these videos possible. And if you do already support me over there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.